He spent 18 Christmases in a place without a home, only to inherit one from a stranger on the one day he had nowhere else to go. What he found there wasn't just a deed to a piece of land. It was a map to a past he never knew he had, and a choice that would define the rest of his life. If you've ever felt like your story was written for you by someone else, then you know what it's like to search for that one page you can write yourself. Stick around, because this is about finding that page. And if you believe in second chances, hit that subscribe button, because that's what we talk about here. The air in Miss Albright's office always smelled like stale coffee and disinfectant, a scent that had become the official fragrance of my childhood. On December 24th, my 18th birthday, that smell was the last thing I would ever associate with the St. Jude's Home for Boys. She slid a manila envelope across the polished surface of her metal desk. The sound was a dry, final scrape. Inside was my birth certificate, a flimsy document that called me Leo Vance, and 5 crisp $20 bills, $100 to start a life I had no instructions for. "Well, Leo," she said, her voice as starched as her blouse, "you've officially aged out. The state's obligation is fulfilled." She didn't smile. She rarely did. Her face was a collection of sharp, efficient lines designed for processing paperwork, not people. For 18 years, I had been a file in her cabinet, a line item in her budget. Now, the file was being closed. Outside, a wet, heavy snow was falling, turning the gray city into a blurry watercolor of smudged headlights and muted sounds. It was Christmas Eve. The other boys, the younger ones who still had a few years left on their sentences, were in the common room, listlessly watching a holiday movie on the old television. They were hyped up on donated cookies and the false hope that this year, a miracle family might show up at the last minute. I'd given up on that particular brand of magic around my 10th birthday. Christmas at St. Jude's wasn't about family. It was about enduring the quiet, aching reminder that you didn't have one. It was a day for counting the years you'd been alone, and I had just hit 18. I took the envelope. My hand was steady, a small act of defiance against the tremor I felt in my chest. "Thank you," I mumbled, the words tasting like ash. "Thank you for what? The cot that was never truly mine? The meals that tasted of institution? The Christmases spent watching other people's joy through a window?" "There's a bus that leaves for downtown at 4, she continued, already looking past me, her focus shifting to the next task. "The shelter on 3rd Street usually has beds available, especially in this weather. It's your best option." My plan, if you could call it that, was to take the $100 and get a room at the cheapest motel I could find for a night or two. I wanted one night, just one, where I could close a door and know no one else had a key. One night of silence that I owned. After that, I didn't know. The future was a blank white wall of snow, and I was walking toward it with no coat. I stood up, the worn vinyl of the chair groaning in protest. I was turning to leave, to walk out of that office and into the vast, terrifying emptiness of legal adulthood, when there was a sharp rap on the door. Miss Albright looked annoyed by the interruption. "Come in." The man who entered was the complete opposite of the world I knew. He wore a dark wool coat dusted with snowflakes, a tailored suit underneath, and leather shoes that looked like they cost more than my entire $100 inheritance. He was older, with silver hair at his temples and a calm, serious expression. He carried a leather briefcase that looked heavy with importance. "Miss Albright?" he asked, his voice a low, resonant hum. "I'm Arthur Abernathy. I'm an attorney. I'm here for Leo Vance." Miss Albright's carefully constructed composure faltered. She looked from the man to me, her eyebrows knitting together in confusion. I felt a surge of panic. A lawyer? My mind raced through every minor infraction, every rule I'd ever bent. Was I in some kind of trouble I didn't even know about? "I'm Leo," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Mr. Abernathy's gaze softened slightly as it landed on me. He gave me a brief, almost imperceptible nod. "I was instructed to meet you here today, on your 18th birthday." He turned his attention back to Ms. Albright. "I have some legal matters to discuss with my client, privately, if you don't mind." The word client hit me like a physical blow. I had never been anyone's client. I was a ward, a case number, a resident. The shift in language was so profound, it made the room feel unsteady. Miss Albright, for the first time since I'd known her, looked completely flustered. She gestured toward the door. "Of course, I'll be outside." She left, closing the door softly behind her. The silence that followed was thick with questions. Mr. Abernathy placed his briefcase on the desk and clicked it open. He didn't seem to be in a hurry. He moved with a deliberate, calming precision. "Please, sit down, Leo," he said. I sank back into the chair. "I understand this is unexpected. I'll be as direct as I can. My client, a man named Silas Blackwood, passed away 2 weeks ago." The name meant nothing to me. It was just a sound, a collection of syllables with no connection to my life. I shook my head. "I don't know anyone by that name." "I didn't expect you would," Mr. Abernathy said. He pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with wax. It looked ancient, like something from another century. Mr. Blackwood was a farmer. He lived his entire life on a piece of land about 2 hours north of here. He was a very private man, and he was your grandfather. The world stopped. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the muffled sounds of the movie from the common room, the frantic beating of my own heart, it all went silent. Grandfather, the word was alien. My file said, "Parents deceased, no known relatives." It was the first sentence in the story of my life, the one that had defined everything. And this man, this stranger in a wool coat, was telling me it was a lie. "That's not possible," I managed to say. "I don't have any family." "According to this," he said, tapping the document he'd pulled from his briefcase, "you do, or you did." He slid the document across the desk. It was a last will and testament. The language was dense and legalistic, but my name was there, typed in clear black ink, Leo Vance, and next to it were the words, "My sole heir." "Silas Blackwood was your mother's father," Mr. Abernathy explained gently. "His will is very specific. Upon his death, his entire estate passes to you. The estate consists of a 300-acre farm, a house, all its contents, and a small savings account." I stared at him, my mind unable to process the scale of what he was saying. A farm, a house, 300 acres. These weren't just words, they were concepts from a different reality. I had spent my life in rooms that were, at most, 10 feet by 12. My worldly possessions fit into a single cardboard box. Why? The question came out as a croak. If he was my grandfather, why was I here? Mr. Abernathy's expression was one of deep professional empathy. "That is a question I cannot answer, Leo, but he left something that might." He pushed the thick, wax-sealed envelope toward me. My name was written on the front in a shaky but elegant script. His instructions were very clear. "On your 18th birthday, I was to bring you to the farm. You are to spend the night there alone, and you are to read this letter." He believed it would explain everything. A car ride with a stranger to a dead man's house to read a letter that was supposed to explain 18 years of abandonment. It sounded like the beginning of a horror movie. But the alternative was the shelter on 3rd Street. It was the biting cold and the gnawing loneliness I already knew. This was a different kind of unknown, and for the first time in my life it felt like it might be an unknown that belonged to me. "The car is waiting," Mr. Abernathy said, as if sensing the decision solidifying in my mind. "We should leave soon if we want to get there before the snow gets too bad." I picked up the envelope from Miss Albright's desk, the one with the $100, and the one from my grandfather. One felt like a severance package from a life of neglect. The other felt impossibly heavy, weighted with the secrets of a family I never knew I had. I stood up, the chair groaning one last time. I didn't look back at the office, didn't say goodbye to anyone. I just walked out into the hallway with Mr. Abernathy, past the closed door of Miss Albright's office, past the sounds of a manufactured Christmas, and toward a future that had, in the span of 10 minutes, been completely and irrevocably rewritten. The snow was falling harder now, blanketing the world in a clean, white sheet. It felt like the world was giving me the one thing I'd never had, a blank page. The drive north was a silent journey through a fading world. The city's gray slush gave way to suburban neatness, which in turn dissolved into the stark, open beauty of the countryside. Mr. Abernathy's car was a bubble of warmth and quiet, the engine a low thrum against the whisper of the tires on the snow-dusted asphalt. I watched the landscape transform through the window, each mile putting more distance between me and St. Jude's. The tightly packed buildings were replaced by skeletal trees clawing at a heavy sky. The world opened up, vast and white and empty. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. I clutched the thick envelope in my lap. It felt warm, as if it held some residual heat from the man who had written it, Silas Blackwood, my grandfather. I tried to picture him, but my imagination failed. Grandfathers in books and movies were kindly old men with smiling eyes and pockets full of candy. My grandfather was a ghost who had ignored me for 18 years, and then, as a final act, had summoned me to his own empty house. It didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a reckoning. Mr. Abernathy didn't press me for conversation. He seemed to understand that I needed the silence to even begin to process the tectonic shift that had just occurred in my life. He drove with a calm competence, his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes on the road. He was a messenger, a ferryman guiding me from one shore to another, and he seemed content to simply perform his duty. After nearly 2 hours, he slowed the car and turned onto a smaller, unpaved road marked by a simple wooden sign that had been weathered into illegibility. The snow was thicker here, the tire tracks of a single vehicle, likely his from a previous visit, the only break in the pristine white blanket. We drove for another half-mile, the trees closing in around us, their branches heavy with snow. And then the woods opened up, and I saw it. The farmhouse stood on a gentle rise, silhouetted against the bruised twilight sky. It was a simple, 2-story structure, with white paint that had peeled and faded to the color of bone. A wide porch wrapped around the front, its railings looking like they were sagging with the weight of 100 winters. A stone chimney, dark with soot, rose from one side of the house, and a large red barn stood behind it like a silent, sleeping giant. Everything was covered in a thick layer of undisturbed snow. There were no lights on, no signs of life. It was a perfect portrait of abandonment. And yet, there was something about it that wasn't sad. It looked patient, like it had been waiting. Mr. Abernathy pulled the car to a stop in front of a narrow, shoveled path leading to the porch. He cut the engine, and the sudden silence was immense. It was a quiet I had never experienced, a deep, resonant stillness that seemed to absorb all sound. "Here we are," he said softly. "Blackwood Farm." He got out of the car and opened the trunk, retrieving a small duffel bag and a cardboard box. I took the liberty of bringing some essentials: non-perishable food, water, a powerful flashlight, blankets. The power is on, and the furnace is old but functional. I had it serviced last week, but the place has been empty for a while. It will be cold. He handed me the supplies, then produced a heavy, old-fashioned iron key ring from his coat pocket. There were at least a dozen keys on it, each one a different shape and size, tarnished with age. These are for you. They open everything on the property: the house, the barn, the sheds, the workshop. I took the keys. They were cold and heavy in my palm, each one representing a door to a life that should have been mine. He then pointed to the thick envelope still in my other hand. Silas's instructions were clear. He wanted you to be alone when you read that. He said you needed to hear his voice without anyone else's influence. He looked at me, his professional demeanor softening into something more human. Do you have any questions I can answer before I go? I had a million questions. Who was my mother? What was she like? Why did she leave? Why did he let me stay in that place for my entire life? But I knew Mr. Abernathy couldn't answer those. Those answers, if they existed at all, were inside the house, inside that envelope. What happens now? I asked. After tonight? That is entirely up to you, Leo, he said. The farm is yours. You can live here. You can sell it. The property and the land are worth a considerable amount of money, especially to the development corporation that has been trying to buy it for years. You could walk away from this a wealthy young man and start over anywhere you want. He paused, then added, or you could stay. The choice is yours. My card is in the box with the supplies. Call me tomorrow or whenever you're ready. I'll help you with the next steps, whatever you decide. He gave me one last searching look. It's a lot to take in, I know. But Silas believed in you. He said you had a good heart and a strong back. He said you'd know what to do. How could he know anything about me? The thought was a flare of anger in the cold confusion. A man who had never met me, never spoken to me, thought he knew my heart. Mr. Abernathy nodded, a silent gesture of farewell, and got back into his car. I stood there in the falling snow, holding a box of food, a bag of blankets, and the keys to a dead man's life, and watched as the red taillights of his car disappeared back down the long, dark driveway, leaving me utterly alone. The silence that descended was absolute. It was just me, the falling snow, and the dark, waiting house. For a moment, fear, sharp and cold, pierced through my shock. I could just turn around, walk down that long driveway, and try to hitch a ride back to the city. I still had the $100. I could go to the shelter. I could choose the misery I knew over this terrifying, uncertain promise, but my feet didn't move. My gaze was fixed on the front door. This was the threshold. Behind that door lay the answers, or maybe just more questions. But they were my questions about my family, my history. For the first time, the story wasn't about a nameless orphan. It was about Leo Vance, the grandson of Silas Blackwood. I had to know what that meant. Taking a deep, cold breath that burned my lungs, I walked up the shoveled path. The wooden steps of the porch groaned under my weight. I fumbled with the key ring, my fingers numb from the cold, trying to find the one that fit the lock. The third key I tried slid into the keyhole. It turned with a heavy, grating clunk, the sound echoing in the profound stillness of the evening. I pushed the door open. A wave of cold, stale air washed over me, carrying the scent of dust, old wood, and something else. Something faintly spicy, like dried herbs. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, shutting out the snow and the night. The house was pitch black. I fumbled for the flashlight Mr. Abernathy had given me, my heart pounding in my chest. I clicked it on, and a powerful beam of white light cut through the darkness, illuminating a world frozen in time. I was standing in a small entryway. To my left was a staircase leading up into darkness. To my right, a living room, where furniture sat shrouded in white cloths like sleeping ghosts. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight. The air was frigid, colder inside than it was out. I found a light switch on the wall and flicked it. Nothing happened. I tried another, and then a single, dim, yellow bulb flickered to life in a dusty overhead fixture, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. The house was humble but solid. The floors were wide planks of dark wood, the walls were covered in faded floral wallpaper, and a large stone fireplace dominated one wall of the living room. It was all meticulously clean, but layered with the fine dust of abandonment. It was clear no one had lived here for a while, but it was also clear that the person who had lived here had cared for it deeply. I set down the supplies on a dust-covered table in the entryway. My hands were shaking, partly from cold, partly from nerves. I had to get the heat on. Mr. Abernathy said the furnace was functional. I found the thermostat in the hallway, an old mercury-filled dial, and pushed the lever up. A few moments later, a low rumble started deep in the belly of the house, and a wave of metallic-smelling heat began to trickle from a floor vent. I walked through the downstairs rooms, my flashlight beam leading the way. The living room, the dining room, a small study filled with books on agriculture and history, and a kitchen with an old porcelain sink and a wood-burning stove alongside a more modern electric one. Everything was in its place, as if the owner had just stepped out for a moment and never returned. In the study, on a large oak desk, sat a framed photograph, face down. My hand trembled as I reached for it. I turned it over. It was a photo of a young woman with a wild, joyful smile and dark, intelligent eyes. She was leaning against a tractor, her hair blowing in the wind, and behind her was the big red barn I had seen outside. She looked familiar in a way that made my heart ache. She had my eyes. This had to be my mother. My legs felt weak. I sank into the dusty chair behind the desk, my gaze locked on the photograph. This was her, a real person, not just a word in a file. She had lived here, in this house, on this land. She had smiled this smile. My fingers found the wax seal on the envelope. It was time. With a deep breath, I broke the seal and unfolded the papers within. There were several pages, filled with that same shaky, elegant handwriting. I angled the desk lamp to better illuminate the words and began to read. "My dearest Leo," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are finally home. I know you have questions. I imagine you have a lifetime of them, and a heart full of anger for the man you believe abandoned you. I will not ask for your forgiveness, for I do not deserve it. I will only ask that you listen to my story, and then judge me as you see fit." The voice that emerged from the page was not that of a cruel monster, but of a man broken by love and regret. His name was Silas, and he was, as Mr. Abernathy had said, my grandfather. He wrote about his daughter, my mother, Eleanor. She was bright and fierce and wild, he said. She loved the farm, but she dreamed of a world beyond its fences. She was a poet, a dreamer, and she felt trapped by the quiet, predictable life he had offered her. When she was 19, she fell in love with a man from the city, a man Silas described as having a restless soul and easy promises. Silas didn't trust him, and he and Eleanor fought. It was a terrible fight, the kind from which some things never recover. In the heat of it, she had screamed that she would rather be an orphan than his daughter. The next morning, she was gone. She left a note saying she was sorry, that she loved him, but that she had to find her own life. Silas spent years looking for her. He hired private investigators. He followed every lead, but she didn't want to be found. Years passed. He heard nothing, until one day a letter arrived. It was from a social worker in the city. Eleanor had passed away from pneumonia just a few weeks after giving birth to a son. Me. My breath hitched in my chest. I had always been told she died in childbirth. This was different. She had been alive, she had held me. Her final letter to Silas was included with his. It was short, written in a weak looping script. She told him she was sick. She told him about me. And she made him promise one thing, that he would not come for me. She was tangled up with dangerous people, she wrote. The man she'd run away with had left her with debts to cruel men. She was terrified that if Silas claimed me, they would find him, find the farm, and use me to hurt him. Keep him safe by staying away, she had written. Let him grow up away from this mess I've made. Let him be anonymous. It's the only gift I can give him. Please, Papa, promise me. And Silas, heartbroken and desperate to honor his daughter's last wish, had promised. He sold a small parcel of his land to create an anonymous trust fund that paid for my care at St. Jude's, with instructions that it was to be presented as state funding. He had driven into the city once a month for 18 years, parking across the street from the orphanage, just to try and catch a glimpse of me in the yard. He had watched me grow up from a distance, a ghost in my own life. I watched you play, he wrote. I saw you fight. I saw you sit alone on the swings. Every day was a torment. I wanted to run across that street, to hold you and tell you that you were not alone, that you had a home. But I had made a promise to my daughter. I chose her memory over your childhood. It was the great sin of my life, and I will carry that shame into the next world. This farm, this house, this land, it is not a gift, Leo. It is an apology. It is the home I was too cowardly to give you. It is all I have left to offer. Tears were streaming down my face, hot trails on my cold skin. I wasn't crying for the boy who spent 18 Christmases alone. I was crying for the old man who had spent 18 Christmases watching him from across a street, trapped by a promise. I was crying for the young woman who had died believing that abandoning her son was the only way to save him. The story of my life wasn't one of abandonment. It was a tangled, tragic story of protection, of a desperate, flawed love that had chosen safety over comfort and loneliness over danger. I wasn't an orphan. I was the secret keeper of a promise made between a dying daughter and her grieving father. The house was slowly warming up, the groaning furnace pushing back the deep chill. But the real warmth was spreading through my chest, a painful, beautiful ache. I looked at the picture of my mother, Eleanor. Her smile didn't look so wild anymore. It looked brave. I finished the letter, my vision blurry. The last lines were a simple plea. Explore the house, Leo. Explore the land. It is your story now. Learn it, and then decide what you will do with it. Whatever you choose, know this: you were never forgotten, and you were always, always loved. I lowered the letter, the papers trembling in my hands. The house was no longer a strange, empty building. It was a testament. Every dusty corner, every creaking floorboard, was a part of a story that I was now at the center of. I was home. And for the first time in my life, I understood what that word really meant. It wasn't just a roof over your head. It was a place where your story began. The weight of that revelation was crushing and liberating all at once. I sat there in the quiet study for what felt like hours, just breathing. Breathing the dusty air of my grandfather's house. My house. The anger I had carried for so long, that cold, hard stone in my chest, was gone. It had been washed away by a flood of grief and a strange, fragile gratitude. You know, it's a funny thing, the stories we tell ourselves to survive. My story was that I was unwanted, that I was a mistake, a piece of cosmic driftwood. It was a simple, clean narrative, and in its own painful way, it made sense. But the truth was so much messier. It was complicated and sad, but it was also full of a love so fierce it was willing to break its own heart to keep me safe. Maybe you're listening to this right now, and you have a story you tell yourself. A story about why you are where you are. About who is to blame for the hurt you carry. I just want to say, what if that's not the whole story? What if there's a letter you haven't read yet? A truth you haven't uncovered? If this is hitting you right now, if you've ever had a moment where your entire past was suddenly reframed, I want you to tell me about it in the comments. I'll read every single one, because I think we all need to know that we're not alone in having to rewrite our own history. We're all just looking for the rest of the story. Now, let's get back to that cold Christmas Eve in a house full of ghosts and secrets. I must have fallen asleep in that old leather chair, because I woke with the start to the pale, gray light of dawn filtering through the dusty window. My neck was stiff, and the pages of Silas's letter were still clutched in my hand. For a disoriented moment, I thought I was back at St. Jude's, woken by the early morning bell. But then, the smell of old books and wood smoke hit me, and the reality of where I was crashed over me again. It wasn't a dream, it was Christmas morning. My first Christmas morning as a free man. My first Christmas morning in a home that was my own. The thought was so staggering, so utterly foreign, that I had to say it out loud just to believe it. This is my home, I whispered into the quiet room. The words hung in the air, solid and real. The house was warmer now, the old furnace having worked all night to chase the worst of the chill from the rooms. I got up and began to walk through the house again, but this time it was different. I wasn't an intruder anymore. I was an heir, exploring my inheritance. I ran my hands along the smooth, worn wood of the banister as I climbed the stairs. I peered into the bedrooms, each one a perfectly preserved diorama of a life. One was clearly my mother's. A faded canopy bed, a shelf full of novels with cracked spines, and a small wooden bird carved with delicate care sitting on the windowsill. I picked it up. It was smooth and light. Silas must have made it for her. His own room was simple, almost monastic. A sturdy oak bed, a handmade quilt, and a single, stark photograph on his nightstand. The same one of Eleanor, my mother, smiling by the tractor. He had looked at her face every night before he slept. I spent the morning like a detective, piecing together the life of the man I never knew. I found his work boots by the back door, caked with the dried mud. I found his reading glasses on a table next to a well-worn armchair. In the kitchen, I found jars of preserves in the pantry, their handwritten labels: peach, 1998, strawberry, 2002, a timeline of lonely harvests. This house wasn't just a structure, it was a biography written in objects. I remembered the last line of his letter. Explore the land. It is your story now. I pulled on my thin jacket, which was no match for the country cold, but it was all I had. Outside, the world was breathtaking. The snow had stopped falling, and a weak winter sun was trying to break through the clouds, making the endless fields of white glitter as if they were sewn with diamonds. The air was so clean and cold it felt like I was breathing for the first time. I made my way toward the big red barn. The snow was deep, coming up to my knees in some places, and the effort of wading through it made me feel alive, my blood pumping, my body working. The barn doors were huge, held shut by a thick wooden beam. It took all my strength to lift it, the wood groaning in protest. The doors swung inward, opening into a vast cathedral-like space. Sunlight streamed in through the gaps in the siding, illuminating columns of dancing dust. The air smelled of hay, earth, and thyme. Old farm equipment stood silent and patient, hulking metal beasts sleeping under blankets of dust. A hayloft ran along the upper level, and a set of stalls lined one wall. It was a place of work, of life, and now of profound silence. Silas's letter had mentioned something else, a riddle that I'd glossed over in my emotional haze the night before. I pulled the letter from my pocket and read it again. "There's more for you to find. Look for it in the place where the sun sets twice." Where the sun sets twice? I looked around the barn, confused. It made no sense. I walked the length of the massive structure, my boots crunching on the dirt and stray bits of straw. I looked up at the rafters, into the empty stalls, behind the old tractor. Nothing. I walked back to the huge barn doors and looked out at the fields. The sun was climbing higher in the sky. It would set in the west, behind the line of trees at the edge of the property. Just one sunset. What did he mean? I leaned against the doorframe, frustrated. Maybe it was just the rambling of an old man, but everything else in his letter had been so deliberate, so purposeful. This had to mean something. I thought about the words. Where the sun sets twice. Maybe it wasn't literal. Maybe it was a metaphor. But for what? My eyes scanned the interior of the barn again, and this time they caught something I'd missed. On the far western wall, high up near the peak of the roof, was a large, circular window, its glass opaque with grime. But below it, cut into the wooden wall at about eye level, was a small, perfectly round knothole. As I stared at it, a stray beam of sunlight lanced through a crack in the roof and hit the wall, illuminating the dust in the air, and then I understood. The sunset. At the end of the day, the setting sun would shine directly through that high window. But for a few moments, just before it disappeared behind the trees, its light would also pass directly through that tiny knothole. From the right spot inside the barn, you would see the light in the big window, and then a second sun would appear on the wall, shining through the knothole. The place where the sun sets twice. My heart started to pound. I walked over to the wall, my eyes fixed on the knothole. I looked at the floor directly beneath it. It was made of thick wooden planks, just like the rest of the barn. But as I looked closer, I saw it. One of the planks had edges that were just a little too perfect, a little too clean. It wasn't a seamless part of the floor, it was a panel. I knelt down, my fingers searching for a seam. I found a small notch on one side, just big enough to get a fingertip into. I pulled. It was stuck fast. I dug in my heels and pulled harder, my muscles straining. With a low groan of protesting wood, the plank came loose. Beneath it was a hollow space, and nestled inside that space was a metal box, the kind used for cash or important documents. It was old and slightly rusted, but heavy and solid. My hands were shaking again as I lifted it out. It wasn't locked. I took a deep breath and opened the lid. Inside, there were 3 things. The first was a stack of old black and white photographs, tied with a faded ribbon. The second was a thick, leather-bound ledger. And on top of it all was another envelope, this one smaller than the last, with my name on it. I opened the letter first. The handwriting was the same. "Leo," it said, "if you found this, you are more clever than I gave you credit for, or perhaps just more stubborn. Both are good qualities to have. What you found last night was the truth of our family. What is in this box is the truth of this farm. They are not the same story." He went on to explain. The farm, as beautiful as it was was in trouble. He was in debt, deep in it. For the last 10 years, a large development corporation called Horizon Holdings had been trying to buy his land. They wanted to build a golf course and luxury vacation homes. Silas had refused again and again. This land was his legacy, his family's story. It wasn't for sale, but Horizon Holdings didn't give up. According to the letter, they started playing dirty. They bought up the loans from the local agricultural bank. They influenced the town council to deny his permits for a farm stand. They made it impossible for him to turn a profit, squeezing him from all sides, trying to force him into foreclosure so they could buy the land for pennies on the dollar. The ledger was his proof. For years, he had meticulously documented everything. Every threatening letter, every denied permit, every conversation with a banker who suddenly turned hostile. He had records of their predatory loan practices, notes on conversations he'd had with other local farmers who had been forced out by the same company. He was building a case against them, but he had run out of time. "This fight is now yours, if you want it," he wrote. "Mr. Abernathy will soon present you with their latest offer. It will be a life-changing amount of money. Enough to wash your hands of this place and never look back. No one would blame you if you took it. God knows, after the life you've had, you deserve an easy path. But this land, Leo, this land has a voice. It speaks of our family, of struggle, of endurance. It is more than just dirt and trees. It is a home, and homes are worth fighting for." The final item in the box was the stack of photographs. I untied the ribbon. They were pictures of my mother, Eleanor, as a little girl, riding a pony, helping Silas in the garden, playing in the hayloft of this very barn, her face alight with pure, unadulterated joy. In every photo, Silas was there, younger, stronger, his face weathered, but his eyes filled with a powerful, protective love for his daughter. This was the life they had shared here. This was the home he was asking me to fight for. A cold dread mixed with a burning anger began to settle in my stomach. The inheritance wasn't a clean slate, it was a declaration of war. I was being given not just a home, but a battleground. And the enemy wasn't a person, it was a faceless corporation, a system designed to crush little guys like my grandfather, like me. As if on cue, I heard the sound of a car coming up the long driveway. I quickly put everything back in the box, slid the plank back into place, and walked out of the barn, blinking in the bright winter sun. It was Mr. Abernathy's car. He got out, holding a sleek, professional-looking folder. His face was impassive, but his eyes were sympathetic. "Leo," he said, his tone gentle. "I apologize for intruding on your Christmas, but this is time-sensitive. I received a call this morning from the legal team at Horizon Holdings. They heard about Silas's passing and the probate transfer to you. They have extended a new offer to purchase the farm." He opened the folder and handed me a sheet of paper. My eyes scanned the text, but they stopped at the number at the bottom of the page. It was so large it didn't seem real. It was more money than I could possibly imagine. Enough to buy a house anywhere, a car, an education. Enough to build any life I wanted, free from worry, free from work, free from struggle. It was the easy path Silas had written about, a golden door swinging open, inviting me to leave this cold, complicated place behind and step into a life of comfort and security. All I had to do was sign the paper. All I had to do was sell my mother's memories, my grandfather's fight. "They need an answer by the end of the year," Mr. Abernathy said. "It's a very generous offer, Leo. In my professional opinion, given the farm's debts, which the sale would more than cover, it is an offer you should seriously consider." I looked from the paper in my hand to the old farmhouse, its paint peeling, its chimney silent. I looked at the big red barn that held my family's secrets. I thought of the pictures of my mother laughing in the hayloft. I thought of Silas, alone in his study, meticulously documenting the injustice being done to him, fighting to protect this place for a grandson he'd never met. The money on that page was just ink. It was an ending, but the farm was a beginning. It was a story, my story. And I realized, with a clarity that was sharp and painful and exhilarating, that I wasn't ready for it to be over. I wanted to know how it ended. I wanted to be the one to write the final chapter. "No," I said, my voice clear and steady. I handed the paper back to Mr. Abernathy. He looked surprised. "No?" "Tell them no," I said, a fire I didn't know I possessed starting to burn in my chest. "Tell them the farm is not for sale." Mr. Abernathy stared at me for a long moment, a slow, unreadable expression spreading across his face. It wasn't disappointment. It was something else, something that looked almost like pride. "All right, Leo," he said, a small smile finally touching his lips. He took the paper and slid it back into the folder. "I'll tell them." He paused, then looked me straight in the eye. Silas left another document with me, a letter of instruction. It said that if you refused the first offer from Horizon, I was to open it. It authorizes me to use the funds from his savings account, the one I mentioned, not for your living expenses but as a retainer. To represent you, to fight them. He tapped the folder. "Your grandfather was a stubborn man. It seems he was counting on you being the same. He's left you a fight, Leo, a hard one, but he didn't leave you to fight it alone." For the second time in 24 hours, tears welled in my eyes. But these weren't tears of grief or confusion. They were tears of fierce, defiant joy. My grandfather hadn't just left me a farm. He had left me a plan. He had left me a purpose. He had left me a choice, and he had trusted me to make the right one. I looked around at the vast, snow-covered land. It didn't look empty anymore. It looked full of potential. It was a battlefield, yes, but it was also a sanctuary. It was my legacy. It was my home, and I was going to defend it. The days that followed were a blur of activity and education. The choice to fight was one thing. The reality of it was another. The house was a looming, constant project. The furnace kept the core rooms livable, but the upstairs was frigid, and a slow drip from the kitchen ceiling warned of problems I didn't have the skills or money to fix. I learned to cook on the old wood stove, the cast-iron behemoth becoming the warm, beating heart of the house. I spent hours cleaning, sweeping away the dust of neglect, trying to make the space feel less like a museum and more like a home. Mr. Abernathy became my only link to the outside world. He called every few days with updates. As promised, he had formally rejected Horizon's offer. Their response was swift and cold. A legal notice informing me that the outstanding loans on the property were being called in. I had 90 days to pay them in full, or the bank, which, as Silas's ledger suggested, was financially entangled with Horizon, would begin foreclosure proceedings. The life-changing sum they had offered me had been replaced by a crushing, life-ending debt. The fight had begun, and the first blow was meant to be a knockout. The number was astronomical. Silas's savings account, the one meant to fund the legal battle, would barely make a dent. For a day, despair washed over me. I sat in the cold silence of the house, the legal notice on the table in front of me, and felt the weight of my decision. The easy path, the golden door, was gone. I had chosen this. I had chosen to be buried under the weight of a dead man's war. But then I would pick up one of the photographs of my mother. I would see her smile, and I would feel a surge of stubborn resolve. This was her home. They were trying to steal her home. The despair would recede, replaced by a cold, hard anger. Mr. Abernathy, true to his word, began to fight. He used Silas's meticulous ledger as a roadmap, filing discovery motions and requests for information, looking for the cracks in Horizon's corporate armor. "They're used to bullying people into submission, Leo," he told me over the phone, his voice calm and steady. "They don't expect a fight. We just have to hold on long enough to find the leverage we need." Holding on meant surviving. I needed supplies, I needed knowledge, and I needed to find a way to make the farm work. My $100 from St. Jude's was long gone. I had to venture into the small town a few miles down the road, a place called Northwood. It was a town that time seemed to have forgotten, with a single main street lined with brick buildings. There was a diner, a hardware store, a post office, and a small grocery. My first trip in, I felt like an alien. Everyone seemed to know each other, and my unfamiliar face drew curious, suspicious stares. I bought what I could: flour, salt, cheap cuts of meat, and retreated back to the farm. But I couldn't stay isolated forever. I needed tools to start making repairs, and advice on how to do it. Swallowing my pride, I walked into the hardware store. It was a wonderland of organized chaos, smelling of sawdust and oil. An old man with a face like a road map and hands as gnarled as oak roots stood behind the counter. His name tag read George. "Help you?" he grunted, not looking up from the lawnmower engine he was tinkering with. I need to fix a leaky roof," I stammered, "on the old Blackwood place." At the name, he stopped his work and looked up at me. His eyes were sharp and intelligent. "You're the boy who inherited it." It wasn't a question. News traveled fast in a town like Northwood. "Yes, sir, I'm Leo." He studied me for a long moment. "Silas was a good man. Stubborn as a mule, but a good man." He wiped his hands on a greasy rag. "A leaky roof is just the start of your problems with that place. What do you know about farming?" "Nothing," I admitted. "What do you know about carpentry, plumbing, electrical?" "Nothing." He let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like rocks grinding together. "So, you know nothing. You've got no money, and you're trying to save a farm that a pack of corporate wolves has been trying to eat for a decade. Son, you're either the bravest damn fool I've ever met, or the stupidest." "Probably a little of both," I said. My honesty seemed to break through his gruff exterior. A flicker of something, respect, maybe, or pity, passed through his eyes. "All right, Leo," he said, sighing. "Let's start with the roof. You'll need tar, shingles, and a hell of a lot of luck." He spent the next hour walking me through the basics, drawing diagrams on a paper bag. He sold me the supplies on credit. "Pay me back when you can," he said gruffly. Silas always did. That small act of trust was the first crack of light in my solitary struggle. Over the next few weeks, I became a regular at George's store. He became a reluctant mentor, teaching me how to patch drywall, how to fix a running toilet, how to read the land. I also started eating lunch at the diner. The waitress, a woman named Sarah with tired eyes and a kind smile, always made sure my coffee cup was full. She'd ask about the farm, and soon other people at the counter started to join in, offering advice, sharing stories about Silas. They told me how he'd helped them rebuild a fence after a storm, how he'd loaned his tractor to a neighbor whose own had broken down during harvest. They painted a picture of a man who was not just a hermit, but a quiet, integral part of the community's fabric. They also told me about Horizon Holdings and the other families they had pushed out. I wasn't the only one fighting this battle. I was just the latest soldier in a long, quiet war. Slowly, the town's suspicion turned into a wary kind of support. They saw me working, saw the lights on in the old farmhouse day after day, week after week. They saw me clearing the overgrown fields, patching the roof in the dead of winter, trying. They saw Silas's stubbornness living on in me. One day, Mr. Abernathy called, his voice tight with excitement. "I think I found it, Leo, our leverage." Following a hunch from Silas's notes, he had dug into the original land surveys. He found that a small forgotten creek that ran through the back of my property had been designated as protected wetlands by the state decades ago. Horizon's development plans, which he had finally managed to obtain through a court order, showed their golf course running straight through it. They had either missed it, or they were planning to illegally drain it and build anyway, betting that no one would notice. Their entire plan is contingent on developing that specific area, Mr. Abernathy explained. If the state enforces the wetland protection, their project is dead in the water. We have them. The foreclosure auction was scheduled for the following week. It felt like a public execution. I had to stand on the courthouse steps while a man in a suit read out the legal notices, my home being sold off to the highest bidder, who everyone knew would be an anonymous shell corporation owned by Horizon. But this time, I wasn't alone. George was there. Sarah was there. A dozen other farmers and townspeople stood with me, a silent, grim-faced show of support. Just as the bidding was about to start, Mr. Abernathy stepped forward and handed a thick file to the auctioneer and to the lawyer representing the bank. It contained the original survey map, the state's environmental protection statutes, and a formal petition to have the land inspected and its protected status enforced. The lawyer's face went pale as he read it. He made a frantic call on his cell phone. After a few tense, whispered minutes, he spoke to the auctioneer. The auction was postponed, pending an environmental review. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a stay of execution. We had bought ourselves time. As I left the courthouse, people patted me on the back. George clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Walking away from the courthouse that day, I felt a sense of belonging that was so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. I had defended my home, not just for me, but for the memory of my family and for the community that had cautiously, then wholeheartedly, embraced me. Spring came to the farm, and with it, a sense of renewal. The snow melted, revealing the rich, dark earth beneath. The skeletal trees began to bud, and the creek in the back pasture, the one that had saved us, swelled with fresh water. The world was coming back to life, and so was I. The legal battle with Horizon dragged on, but their position was crippled. The state confirmed the wetland status, and their project was tangled in a web of environmental regulations and bad publicity. They were still a threat, but the immediate danger had passed. I had won the first major battle in my grandfather's war. I started to work the land. With George's help, I got the old tractor running. I plowed a small field and planted vegetables, following the instructions in Silas's old farming almanacs. The work was brutal, back-breaking, and utterly satisfying. Every stone I cleared from the field, every seed I planted in the soil, felt like an act of creation, an act of defiance. I was putting down roots, literally and figuratively. One warm evening, I was sitting on the porch, watching the sunset over the fields. The house behind me was no longer a cold, silent museum. It was a home, filled with the sounds and smells of my life. The leaky roof was patched, the kitchen was warm, and the rooms were clean. It was still old, still scarred, but it was mine. I had earned it. I thought about the journey that had brought me here. The boy who had walked out of St. Jude's on Christmas Eve was gone. He had been so lost, so empty, so convinced that his life was a meaningless accident. He wouldn't recognize the man sitting on this porch, his hands calloused from work, his face weathered by the sun and wind, his heart full. I realized that Silas's greatest gift to me wasn't the land or the house. It was the choice. He didn't just give me a home. He gave me the chance to build one. He gave me a fight that taught me how to be strong, a community that taught me how to belong, and a history that taught me who I was. An inheritance isn't about what you're given. It's about what you do with it. It's about the parts of the story you choose to honor, the promises you choose to keep. My story began with a lie, that I was alone. But the truth was, I had been surrounded by a fierce, invisible love all along. A mother's desperate sacrifice, a grandfather's silent vigil. And now I was surrounded by a community that had chosen to stand with me. My life was not a story of abandonment, but one of profound, complicated, and hard-won connection. The scars of my past are still there, they always will be, but they are no longer the whole story. They are just the first chapter of a much longer, much richer book, a book that I am now writing for myself, one day at a time, on this small, stubborn piece of land. And that brings us to today. The fight isn't over, and life here is far from easy, but every sunrise feels like a promise, and every sunset feels like a victory. I found my home, not in a building, but in a purpose. So, I want to ask you, what does home mean to you? Is it a place, a person, a feeling? Share your story in the comments below, because the most powerful thing we can do is share our stories and realize we're not as alone as we think. This channel is a community for people who have had to fight for their own happy ending, for people who believe in second chances. If that's you, I hope you'll subscribe and join us, because every story of survival makes us all a little bit stronger. Thank you for listening.